My strongest memories of the church I grew up in are all visceral. I remember the floor in the hallway and entryway that was made up of thousands of little pebbles and had a wonderful texture for little hands to touch. I remember climbing up the rickety little metal spiral staircase that led to a little loft above the office and always wondering if it was going to break. They don't let people climb up that staircase anymore. I remember sitting on the brown, tan, and red carpet in the main meeting room and tracing my fingers around the circles that made up the pattern. And the sound of a percolator and the smell of coffee brewing always brings me back to the years when we brewed coffee in the back of the same room that we had services in. These embodied memories are connected for me to the feelings I had at that church, feelings of safety, love, and acceptance. The way that we experience a place, both the physical embodied experience of the space and the feelings that we associate with it, often stick with us more than the words we hear or the activities we participate in. Our brains are simply wired that way. And when we experience good feelings in a particular place, we tend to view everything about that place in a positive light. I loved that brown, tan, and red carpet, and it had nothing to do with it being pretty. When we love a place, we overlook any flaws that it might have and sometimes even get attached to some of those flaws. No matter how many times someone here quips about those orange curtains in the dining room, I know that there are secretly some of you who love them. You know it's true. The reality of our spaces, however, is that they aren't just our precious memories. They also say something about who we are. From the earliest days of church architecture, the buildings in which we worship have said a lot about who we are as a faith community. Our architecture often speaks to our theology and our way of doing church. One easy example of this is the difference between churches focused on sacrament and churches focused on text and preaching. If you go into most Catholic churches, for example, you'll notice that the focal point of the sanctuary is the altar, where communion is served at every Mass. In most Protestant churches, on the other hand, you'll notice that the focal point of the sanctuary is the pulpit, where the Bible is read and sermons are preached. You can see that in this very sanctuary, where this pulpit is right in the middle of the room. It couldn't be more prominent. And the closest thing that we have to an altar, our little chalice and candles table over there, is way over in the corner. This particular church building was built in a Greek revival style, a common style for congregational churches in the pre-Civil War era. The goal was for it to feel like a Greek temple, a sanctuary apart from the world and dedicated to an intellectual faith. These white walls and the plain glass windows are reminiscent of the Puritan tradition from which we emerged. Puritan churches were famous for their simplicity, as their services were meant to be focused on the Word and the Word only, readings from the Bible and long sermons from the preacher, and they didn't want anything to distract the congregation from that. My guess is that those of us who come here every week don't think much about the theological claims that the aesthetics of this church might make. But what if it's your first time here? For some of you today, it is. What do you see, hear, smell, feel? And what does it tell you about this community? I can tell you that I never thought much about what values my childhood fellowship was espousing with its building when I was growing up. But I bet you all would have a lot of thoughts about it if you walked into it for the first time. And we're going to see if this works. It did work. So here's a picture of the main meeting room. There's another view of it. What's your first impression from looking at these two pictures? Warm? Small. Yeah, it was small. It was small. When I look at the pictures now, I always think that it looks more like a home than a church, which is not uncommon in the Midwest. There was this whole movement at the end of the 1800s when, by the way, we first had women ministers, that emphasized church as home and sought to make churches that were useful all week and not just on Sunday mornings. Now, given that this is my baseline experience of Unitarian Universalism, you might not be surprised to hear that when I first came to New England, I was a little shocked by the UU churches I found. My first Sunday in Boston, I went to visit Arlington Street Church and was greeted with this view. And let me tell you, I was convinced that I had come to the wrong church. I think it was the first time I had actually ever seen box pews, and that pulpit was so high that I expected fire and brimstone to be preached from it. Now, of course, I eventually became a member at Arlington Street Church. I met my closest friends there, mourned the loss of a dear friend in those pews, and preached my first real sermon in that high pulpit. And now when I return there, it feels like home. It's a very large and formal home, but home nonetheless. And yet, my first impression of it has also stuck with me. That question in my mind, is this really a Unitarian Universalist church? Was all about the way it looked and the way that didn't match up with my vision of our modern, non-hierarchical faith. In many ways, this is the plight of the historic Unitarian Universalist church. We dwell in these gorgeous old buildings that don't necessarily speak to our faith of the future. We find ourselves physically boxed in by fixed pews and fixed pulpits and rooms that are anything but multi-purpose, while our faith is ever more expansive and flexible. Our beliefs and practices are often way outside the box, even as the space that we inhabit is about as traditional as it gets. Now, this is exactly the reason that our National Unitarian Universalist Association ended up selling their historic property on Beacon Hill in Boston in 2014 and moving to a modern building in the aptly named Innovation District. So here's a few pictures of that old Beacon Hill property. It was right next to the State House, too, so prime real estate. That's a meeting room. And there's the old chapel. You gotta love the old pictures. For over 80 years, it served as the home of first the American Unitarian Association and then the Unitarian Universalist Association. And it was a beautiful space. I remember the first time that I went there, I could literally feel the history emanating from those walls. But there were drawbacks to the space as well. Much of it couldn't get high-speed internet, which was a running joke among UUA employees. And it was definitely lacking in accessibility. I think that there was one old rickety elevator and lots of little narrow stairways. The offices were split up on several floors and between 3 different buildings, so collaboration was a challenge. Though the space was beautiful and historic, it was not serving the needs of a 21st century faith, nor was it giving the impression to visitors that we were even trying to be a 21st century faith. When the UUA first announced that they were moving, there were a lot of people who were understandably upset. But I have to admit, I was excited. Did we really want our faith to be represented by a stuffy old building in one of the richest neighborhoods in Boston? What did that say about who we are and who we are trying to become? So here's the new headquarters. A little different, right? Here's the new chapel. It's not a perfect location or building. Nothing is. But think about the difference between your sense of space, this space here, versus those old headquarters. How does it change your view of our faith? To me, the new headquarters presents us as a vibrant, evolving faith. Others will say that it's too modern and feels more like a high-tech company than a religious organization. Either way, it changes our perception of who we are, and even more than that, it changes visitors' perceptions of who we are. For better or for worse, our new headquarters say something about our faith. All of this makes me wonder, what is it that our building says about who we are as a congregation here at UU Nashua? And what kind of first impression does this space give? Is it the impression that we want to be presenting to the world? One thing I've noticed is that often when I'm talking to folks in Nashua about this church and describe where it is, their response is, "Oh yeah, you're the big white church on the hill." The big white church on the hill. I cringe a little bit at that particular description, apt as it is for describing how we look from across the street. The big white church on the hill. We could spend a while unpacking that one. Now, I don't want to try to dictate what you think about our space, but I do want to get you thinking. What is it that our building says, both inside and out, about our values and who we are as a congregation? If you've been here for a while and are struggling to see this place with new eyes, find someone who is relatively new and ask them what their first impression was upon entering this space. And did that first impression match up with what they learned later about this community of faith? The real truth, of course, about communities of faith is that we are not buildings. We are so much more than that. At our core, we are not white walls or stained glass or ornate woodwork. We are a community of people. We are a community of humanity and love. About 5 years ago, I went back to my childhood church and discovered that they had replaced my beloved red and tan and brown carpet. The part of me that remembered sitting on that carpet and tracing those circles was a little bit devastated. Now, I've now been back there a couple more times, and I have to admit that that carpet was probably really dirty. And it definitely looked more 1970s than anyone wants to in the 21st century. And more than that, I realized that this was actually the same community that had always been there. It was still the community of love and justice that I remembered, even without that carpet. We are so much more than our buildings, and yet Sometimes we get trapped by our buildings. The spaces that we inhabit end up defining how we do things and presenting a certain picture to the world about who we are. How do we break through the narratives that our buildings create? And even more than that, how do we make sure that our buildings don't end up tethering us to a narrative that isn't really ours anymore? This is the challenge of the 21st century church in the 19th century building. This is our challenge as the UU Church of Nashua, and our challenge as Unitarian Universalists. Our church is more than a framework. Ours is a church of humanity and love.
The ceiling is high to let your soul rise up to the angels who teach you to fly. And when you're weary of clouds, it helps you back down and welcomes you home to this hallowed ground. It's gilded in gold, gilded in rust, for heaven below and heaven above. The heaven we know here in this world, here in our holy church of the earth. The windows are wide, so darkness and light, mystery and beauty will greet you inside. And there's room enough for all of us to gather in friendship, to gather in love. It's gilded in gold, gilded in rust, for heaven below and heaven above. The heaven we know here in this world, here in our holy church of the earth. Church of life, ancient and bright, light that inside us shines, life that we share. This is our prayer, that we may always find the heaven we seek here at our feet, here in this sunshine, in this heartbeat. Oh, it's gilded in gold, gilded in rust, from heaven below and heaven above. The heaven we know here in this world, here in our holy church of the earth. Gilded in gold, gilded in rust, for heaven below and heaven above. The heaven we know here in this world, here in our holy church of the earth. The heaven we know here in this world, here in our church.